On a winter morning in 73 BC, 70 men stood at the edge of Mount Vesuvius. Below them was a sheer, 1,000-foot drop into jagged rocks. Behind them was a Roman army that outnumbered them 50 to 1, slowly starving them to death. They had two choices: die by the Roman sword or die by the fall. So, Spartacus made a decision that sounded like insanity. He ordered his men to jump off the cliff. If you read the Roman reports from that day, this shouldn't have been a battle. It should have been a mass suicide. There was no path down that side of the volcano. There were no stairs, no ropes, and no way out. The Roman commander, Claudius Glaber, didn't even bother posting guards on the cliffside because he knew physics doesn't negotiate. If they went over the edge, they would die. But history is written by the survivors, and when Spartacus and his army jumped off that cliff, they didn't hit the bottom. They vanished. By the end of this video, you are going to learn how one man turned a suicidal leap into the most brilliant ambush in military history. You'll see the impossible engineering hack they used to cheat gravity, and exactly what happened when the Romans looked over the edge and realized the gladiators were gone. The year is 73 BCE. Mount Vesuvius looms dark against the Italian sky, not yet the volcano that would bury Pompeii, but about to witness something equally devastating. On its slopes, 70 escaped gladiators huddle together, surrounded by 3,000 Roman soldiers. The rebels have no armor, no proper weapons, no military training beyond the arena. The Roman commander sleeps soundly in his tent, confident that sunrise will bring easy victory. He has blocked the only path down the mountain. His men control every approach. The slaves are trapped like animals awaiting slaughter. But as darkness deepens, something stirs among the gladiators. Their leader, a Thracian whose name would echo through history, studies the sheer cliff face that drops 200 feet into shadow. Everyone says it's impossible to descend. Everyone says they're already dead. To understand how this impossible victory happened, we need to go back 48 hours to when the first drops of Roman blood hit Italian soil. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of history's most decisive battles, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic war content. Ring the notification bell to never miss another incredible military upset. Now, let me take you back to 73 BCE, when Rome's arrogance created its worst nightmare. 73 BCE. The Roman Republic stretches across the Mediterranean, its power built on a foundation of human misery. 1 in every 3 people walking Roman streets wears the invisible chains of slavery. They work the fields, build the monuments, and die for entertainment in the arena. Rome's economy runs on stolen lives. In Capua, 200 miles south of Rome, stands the gladiator school of Lentulus Batiatus, a factory of death where men are trained to kill for the crowd's amusement. Here, 3 names would soon terrify every Roman citizen. Spartacus, the Thracian enigma. Once a soldier, some say fighting for Rome itself before fate threw him into chains. In the arena, he moved like death given form, each motion calculated, efficient, lethal. But behind those cold eyes worked a strategic mind that saw beyond the sand and blood. Crixus, the Gallic berserker. Where Spartacus fought with precision, Crixus fought with fury. Built like a siege engine, he could break shields with his bare hands. The crowds loved his savage style, never knowing that beneath the rage burned dreams of vengeance against every Roman who had ever held a whip. Oenomaus, the Celtic strategist. Older than the others, scarred from 100 battles, he understood something his younger companions were still learning. Raw strength meant nothing without tactics. He had survived longer than any gladiator had a right to, and he intended to die free. These men should have been enemies, Thracian, Gaul, and Celt forced to fight each other for Roman entertainment. But in the fetid barracks of Batiatus's school, they found common cause. The spark came when Batiatus decided to sell them to fight to the death in a special event. Better to die free than perform for Roman pleasure. The breakout itself became legend. 200 gladiators armed with kitchen knives and cleavers from the school's kitchens. Guards caught completely off guard. In minutes, the impossible happened. Gladiators flooded into the streets of Capua. Only 70 escaped the city, but those 70 would shake Rome's foundations. Here's where Roman arrogance sealed their fate. The Senate didn't send legions. Why waste real soldiers on kitchen slaves? They appointed Gaius Claudius Glaber, a praetor more comfortable with politics than warfare, and gave him 3,000 militia, citizen soldiers eager for easy glory against poorly armed slaves. What happened next defied all military logic. Within days, the 70 gladiators had grown to 700 as slaves abandoned their masters to join the rebellion. Word spread like wildfire. Gladiators had beaten Roman guards. The impossible had happened once. It could happen again. But Spartacus had a plan that would shatter Roman confidence forever. Glaber marched from Rome with 3,000 militia, their bronze helmets gleaming in the autumn sun. These weren't Rome's elite legionaries who had conquered Carthage and Greece. These were shopkeepers and farmers playing soldier, drawn by promises of easy victory and slave gold. They sang as they marched, already dividing imaginary spoils. What Glaber didn't know would kill him. His militia carried standard equipment, short swords, square shields, throwing spears. But they lacked the one thing that made Roman legions invincible: discipline, forged in years of campaign. They were civilians in armor, about to face men who killed for a living. The equipment disparity should have been decisive. The gladiators had seized kitchen implements during their escape: meat cleavers, roasting spits, a few rusty swords from the school's practice weapons. They'd ambushed a wagon of gladiatorial equipment, gaining perhaps 24 real weapons among 700 men. Against 3,000 armed soldiers, it was laughable. But here's where it gets insane. Spartacus didn't choose to make his stand on open ground, where Roman numbers would overwhelm them. He chose Mount Vesuvius, not yet the volcano that would bury cities, but a mountain covered in wild vines and dense forest. The locals avoided it, claiming the gods slept uneasily in its caves. The mountain rose like a great fist from the Campanian plain. Its lower slopes crawled with thick vegetation, but the upper reaches were sheer cliff faces of volcanic rock. Most importantly, there was only one path to the summit, a narrow track barely wide enough for 3 men to walk abreast. It was a natural fortress with a fatal flaw: no escape route. Glaber arrived and immediately saw what every military manual would tell him. The slaves had trapped themselves. He positioned his forces at the single path's base, establishing a textbook siege. Why risk Roman lives attacking uphill when starvation would do the work? His engineers estimated the gladiators had maybe 3 days of water, a week of food if they rationed. Let them eat grass. Glaber reportedly told his officers, "We'll collect their bodies when they're too weak to hold their kitchen knives." But Glaber missed one crucial detail that would cost him everything. While he counted days until surrender, the gladiator numbers swelled. Every night, small groups of escaped slaves slipped through the forests, drawn by whispers of gladiators who had beaten Romans. The 70 had become 300, then 500, then 700. Each new arrival brought information about Roman positions, guard rotations, weaknesses. Spartacus organized them with arena efficiency. Crixus trained the strongest in gladiatorial combat techniques. Oenomaus taught group tactics, turning rabble into something resembling units. But they all knew the mathematics of siege. 700 starving men, even trained killers, couldn't break through 3,000 soldiers holding the only path down. The Romans settled into comfortable routine. Glaber posted rotating guards at the path. But why exhaust his men? The slaves were trapped. Dice games started. Wine appeared from somewhere. The militia began treating it like a camping trip, with guaranteed victory at the end. They built cooking fires, told stories, and laughed about how they'd spend their share of slave auction gold. On the mountain, gladiators looked down at the Roman fires multiplying like stars. Some argued for a desperate charge, better to die fighting than starve. But Spartacus stood at the cliff edge, studying something in the fading light. The sheer rock face dropped 200 feet straight down, impossible for men to climb. But Spartacus wasn't looking at the rock. Pattern interrupts weaved through the narrative. Each time readers thought they understood the situation, new information shifted the perspective. The wild vines covering the upper mountain seemed like decoration. The gladiators' desperate situation appeared hopeless. Glaber's confidence felt justified. What happened next would become military legend. As darkness fell on Mount Vesuvius, Glaber went to sleep believing victory was assured. His guards played dice by firelight. The militia dreamed of glory and gold. Above them, 700 men who had nothing left to lose prepared to attempt the impossible. 2100 hours. Darkness swallowed Mount Vesuvius. Below, Roman campfires dotted the mountainside like a constellation of complacency. Above, Spartacus held a length of wild vine, testing its strength. The plant grew thick on the upper slopes, some vines as wide as a man's wrist, strengthened by volcanic soil. "It will never hold," Crixus growled, watching Spartacus wrap the vine around a boulder. The Gaul was built for smashing through shield walls, not whatever madness the Thracian planned. But Spartacus had noticed something during their days trapped on the summit. These weren't ordinary vines. The volcanic soil had created plants of unusual strength, their fibers dense and flexible. More importantly, they grew in vast tangles that could be harvested without leaving the cliff top. What followed wasn't heroics. It was desperate innovation. Groups of gladiators began cutting vines with their pathetic collection of blades. Others stripped leaves and twisted the vines into crude ropes. Oenomus, the practical Celt, organized the work with arena efficiency. Men who had fought to entertain now labored to survive. 2200 hours. The first rope was ready, 50 feet of twisted vine, not nearly enough to reach the bottom of the 200-foot cliff. But the gladiators had learned something in the arena. Survival meant adapting. They began splicing vines together, using techniques learned from repairing practice equipment. Each connection was tested with the weight of 2 men. Then Spartacus did something nobody expected. He volunteered to go first. This is when everything went wrong for Rome. A commander should send others to test danger. But Spartacus understood what Glaber never would. These weren't soldiers following orders. They were desperate men following hope. If hope died on that cliff, the rebellion died with it. 2300 hours. Spartacus wrapped the vine rope around his waist and approached the cliff edge. 700 men held their breath. Below, a Roman sentry walked his rounds, spear glinting in firelight. The mathematics were simple. If the rope snapped, Spartacus would fall 200 feet onto volcanic rock. If he survived the descent, he'd face 3,000 enemies alone. The first few feet were the worst. The rope creaked under his weight. Volcanic rock, sharp as broken glass, tore at his hands. But here's where gladiator training proved invaluable. Years of gripping weapons through pain had created hands that could endure punishment. Spartacus descended hand over hand, each movement controlled despite muscles screaming protest. 50 feet down, disaster. The rope caught on a rock outcrop, soaring against the sharp edge with each movement. Spartacus hung in space, calculating. Pull too hard, and the vine would snap. Move too slowly, and Roman sentries might spot movement on the cliff face. But hidden in the darkness, physics became their ally. Spartacus shifted his weight, penduluming along the cliff until the rope pulled free. The descent continued. 100 feet, 150, each yard an eternity of burning muscles and held breath. 0 hours. Midnight. Spartacus's feet touched solid ground behind Roman lines. The impossible had become possible, but one man behind enemy positions meant nothing. He signaled upward, a low whistle like a night bird. The next 30 seconds would decide everything. On the cliff top, Crixus grabbed a rope. The Gallic giant who could break shields now trusted his life to woven plants. His descent was less graceful than Spartacus's, more controlled fall than climb, but volcanic vines held true. One by one, gladiators rappelled down the cliff face. Young slaves with trembling hands, veterans with arena scars, kitchen slaves who had never held a weapon. Each descent was a roll of dice against death. The ropes frayed. Hands bled. Men bit through their tongues to keep from crying out as volcanic rock shredded skin. 100 hours. 50 gladiators on the ground. Then 100. The Roman sentries continued their lazy rounds, never looking up at the cliff everyone knew was impossible to descend. Wine and dice held more interest than duty. But the slaves weren't done yet. Some ropes snapped under use, dropping men the last 20 feet onto volcanic stone. Bones cracked. Blood flowed. But even injured gladiators crawled into formation, ready to fight or die. Pain was an old companion from the arena. 1:30 hours. 300 gladiators stood in Roman darkness. Weapons were distributed, kitchen knives to those who could use them, rocks and lengths of vine to the rest. This wasn't an army. It was a pack of cornered wolves who had found a way to bite. Here's the detail historians don't want you to know. The descent took nearly 4 hours. 4 hours when any Roman guard looking up would have spotted dark shapes against grey stone. 4 hours when a snapping rope's sound could have alerted sentries. 4 hours when everything should have gone wrong. 200 hours. 700 men stood where Rome said no man could stand. They formed into rough groups, Crixus leading the strongest, Oenomaus organizing flanking units, Spartacus pointing toward the Roman camp spread before them like a feast. The transformation was beginning. Starving slaves were about to become an army, using Roman equipment stripped from Roman dead. By midnight, 700 armed slaves stood where Rome said no man could stand. The killing ground was prepared. All that remained was to water it with blood. 200 hours. 700 shadows moved through darkness toward 3,000 sleeping Romans. Spartacus raised his hand, the arena signal for readiness. Behind him, gladiators gripped kitchen knives and sharpened stakes. In minutes, they would either be free or dead. The Roman camp stretched before them, a sprawling mess of tents and campfires. Glaber hadn't bothered with proper fortification. Why build walls when the enemy was trapped on a mountain? Sentries walked predictable patterns, more concerned with staying warm than watching for impossible attacks. 2:15 hours. Spartacus pointed to the nearest sentry post. Crixus nodded, moving with surprising stealth for such a large man. The Roman guard never heard death approaching. A hand covered his mouth. A kitchen blade found the gap beneath his helmet. The first Roman died in silence, his spear passing to eager slave hands. What Glaber didn't know would kill him, and 2,800 of his men. 2:30 hours. The advance began in earnest. Gladiators spread through the camp's edges like oil seeping through cloth. Each dead sentry meant another real weapon. Each captured spear turned a kitchen slave into a soldier. The mathematics of power shifted with every silent kill. Then came the moment that would echo through centuries. A Roman soldier, stumbling from his tent to relieve himself, walked directly into Oenomaus's group. His scream, "The slaves are behind us," shattered the night like breaking glass. 300 hours. Panic erupted through the Roman camp. Soldiers stumbled from tents, half-dressed, grabbing for weapons in the dark. They expected to find a few desperate slaves. Instead, 700 killers flowed between the tents like a tide of vengeance. But gladiators knew how to kill efficiently. Arena training took over. Spartacus's men didn't waste energy on battle cries or dramatic charges. They killed with mechanical precision, thrust, twist, move to the next target. Every dead Roman meant better equipment for a slave. The next 3 hours would determine everything. In the command section, officers tried to form their men into fighting units. "Form ranks!" a centurion screamed. "Shield wall!" But panicked militia couldn't form ranks in darkness, with enemies already among them. The centurion's commands ended in a gurgle, as Crixus's captured spear found his throat. 3:15 hours. Full assault launched. What happened next defied all military logic. Roman military doctrine depended on organized formations, disciplined movements, coordinated attacks. But there were no formations in the dark. No discipline when death came from every shadow. No coordination when officers died before orders could be given. Individual combat erupted everywhere. A Roman soldier, brave despite his fear, managed to form a small group of comrades. They locked shields, presenting spears outward, textbook defensive position. But these weren't legionaries. when Crixus led a charge directly at their shields, while other gladiators flanked through the darkness, their formation crumbled like sand. Watch what happens when desperation meets genius. The gladiators didn't fight like soldiers, they fought like survivors. Where Romans expected formal battle lines, slaves flowed like water around obstacles. Where Romans shouted for officers, gladiators communicated with arena hand signals, silent and effective. 3:30 hours. The cascade of Roman failures accelerated. Without officers, militia reverted to terrified civilians. Some tried to flee toward the mountain path, running directly into more gladiators. Others abandoned weapons to run faster, making themselves easy prey. The organized Roman force became a mob, and mobs die easily. This is where the story takes a dark turn. In Glaber's command tent, the praetor woke to screams and clashing metal. He grabbed his sword, shouting for his guards. No answer came. Outside his tent, shadows moved with deadly purpose. His expensive armor, meant to impress rather than protect, tangled as he tried to dress in panic. But then, physics became their weapon. Romans fleeing downhill in darkness tripped over tent ropes, cooking equipment, their own dead. Gravity pulled panicked men into fatal falls. The mountain that had trapped the slaves now channeled Romans into killing grounds where gladiators waited with stolen spears. 400 hours. Individual combat vignettes painted the night in blood. A young Roman, maybe 17, faced a scarred gladiator. The boy held his shield high, textbook perfect. The gladiator feinted left. The boy responded correctly. Then kitchen knife found kidney from an angle no military manual taught. Youth and training meant nothing against experience and desperation. The killing was methodical, the victory absolute. Spartacus found himself facing 3 Romans who had managed to don armor. They advanced in formation, shields locked. In the arena, this would have been a death sentence. But Spartacus had learned something on the mountain. Sometimes, the impossible was just another word for unexpected. He threw dust in their faces, rolled beneath their spear thrust, and hamstrung one from behind. As their formation collapsed, other gladiators finished them. But wait, there's more horror. Across the camp, a gladiator recognized his former master among the Roman officers. The man who had bought him, branded him, forced him to kill friends for entertainment. What followed wasn't combat, it was years of rage given form. The master's expensive sword proved useless against someone who had nothing left to lose. 4:30 hours. Dawn approached, revealing the transformation. Where Romans had camped, gladiators now stripped armor from cooling bodies. Bronze helmets replaced rags on slave heads. Military sandals replaced bare feet. Most importantly, real weapons filled hands that hours before held kitchen utensils. Here's where it becomes a horror story for Rome. The statistics were staggering. Of 3,000 Roman militia, fewer than 200 escaped the mountain. Those who fled spread tales of demons rising from solid rock, of shadows that killed without sound, of the impossible becoming reality. Weapons and armor for 2,800 men now equipped the growing slave army. But more than equipment changed hands that night. Every gladiator who donned Roman armor underwent a psychological transformation. They were no longer escaped slaves. They were an army that had destroyed Romans. Pattern interrupts throughout the battle kept the horror fresh. Each time Romans thought they had organized resistance, it crumbled. Each time slaves seemed overwhelmed, Roman panic created new opportunities. The battle wasn't a single event, but hundreds of individual fights where desperation defeated discipline. 500 hours. The sun rose on a changed world. Where Roman confidence had camped, only death remained. Glaber's body was found near his tent, pierced by a dozen weapons. No one gladiator claimed the kill, suggesting he died in the chaos rather than heroic single combat. This single moment changed Rome forever. News traveled faster than fleeing survivors. Slaves had not only escaped, they had annihilated a Roman force. The impossible had happened, and every slave in Italy heard the message: Rome could bleed. As dawn broke, the impossible had happened. 700 kitchen slaves had become an army of 2,800, armed with Roman steel and armored in Roman bronze. But transformation requires blood, and the bill was about to come due. 5:30 hours. Dawn painted Mount Vesuvius in shades of crimson, fitting colours for what lay below. Spartacus stood among the Roman dead, no longer a slave, but not yet comprehending what he'd become. Around him, gladiators stumbled through the carnage, stripping equipment with mechanical efficiency born from years of scavenging arena sand. The final hour of slaughter had been absolute. Roman military records, carefully vague about this disaster, suggest fewer than 200 militia escaped. Those who lived ran with tales that grew in the telling: slaves descending from the sky, shadows that killed without mercy, the death of Roman invincibility. But the dawn would reveal the impossible made real. Exact casualty figures tell the story. 2,800 Roman dead littered the mountainside. Their equipment, hastily counted by practical Oenomaus, included full armor for nearly 3,000 men, short swords, spears, shields, even the camp's supply wagons untouched in the chaos. What happened next is still studied in military academies. The slave army transformation was instant and irreversible. Men who had fought with kitchen knives now hefted perfectly balanced gladius swords. Backs marked by whips now bore bronze breastplates. Most importantly, minds shaped by servitude now understood a fundamental truth: Romans died like anyone else. Individual aftermath stories spread like wildfire. A young slave found his former master among the dead, the man who had sold his family. He took the Romans' armor, but left the body unlooted, a message to any who found it. A gladiator who had lost an eye in the arena claimed a centurion's helmet, its plume marking him as more than property. Each piece of equipment carried symbolic weight heavier than bronze. Word spreading across Italy traveled on 2 sets of feet, fleeing Romans and escaping slaves. The Romans spoke of military disaster, of impossible tactics, of certain death. But slaves heard a different message. Gladiators had weapons now. Gladiators had won. Gladiators were recruiting. This is when Roman arrogance became fatal. The Senate's response revealed how deeply they misunderstood what had happened. They didn't declare emergency. They didn't recall legions from distant frontiers. They sent another praetor with more militia, certain that proper Roman authority would cow rebellious property. Rome's shock was psychological as much as military. For generations, Roman supremacy had been unquestioned. Legions might struggle against Carthage or Germanic tribes, but slaves? The social order itself depended on the impossibility of successful servile rebellion. Mount Vesuvius shattered that impossibility. But every triumph carries the seed of tragedy. The symbolic victory carried a weight Spartacus perhaps didn't foresee. Within days of Vesuvius, the 700 became 2,000. Within weeks, 10,000. Slaves abandoned fields, fled urban households, broke from chain gangs. They came with nothing but desperation and hope, expecting the gladiators to work another miracle. The mathematics were terrible. Every freed slave meant another mouth to feed, another body to arm, another person depending on gladiator protection. The Roman equipment from Vesuvius, seemingly endless in the dawn light, proved finite when distributed among thousands. Kitchen knives returned to many hands, but now they carried different meaning. Weapons of the desperate became symbols of the possible. Here's the detail historians don't want you to know. Spartacus faced a choice that morning on Vesuvius. He could have taken the weapons and fled. 700 well-armed gladiators might have reached the Alps, found freedom in Germanic lands. Instead, he looked at the gathering crowd of desperate slaves and made the decision that would doom them all. He stayed to fight for everyone. The transformation was complete but unstable. Where arena sand had created individual killers, Mount Vesuvius had forged an army. But armies need more than weapons. They need supplies, strategy, purpose beyond survival. The gladiators had proven slaves could kill Romans. Now they had to prove something harder, that they could live free. Individual gladiators faced personal transformations. Men who had fought for crowd pleasure now fought for principle. The armor they wore had been stripped from enemies they killed. each piece a reminder that freedom came through blood. Some gladiators wept that morning, not from sorrow but from the overwhelming realization that they owned themselves again. But this victory at Vesuvius would ultimately seal their fate. Every dead Roman created 10 who wanted revenge. Every freed slave increased Roman determination to restore order through terror. The mathematics of rebellion are cruel. The greater the hope, the harsher the eventual punishment. As morning gave way to day, practical matters intruded on triumph. Bodies needed disposal before disease spread. Weapons required distribution according to skill. Most urgently, the growing crowd needed food, and Roman supply wagons wouldn't last long among thousands. What followed wasn't a battle. It was the birth of a legend that would haunt Rome for centuries. 70 men with kitchen knives had become an army. The impossible had become inevitable. But as Spartacus would learn, winning freedom and keeping it were different battles entirely. The rebellion's growth from 700 to 120,000 happened with terrifying speed. Within 2 years, what began on Mount Vesuvius became the Third Servile War, the largest slave uprising in human history. Spartacus proved that Vesuvius was no fluke, defeating 9 Roman forces, including 2 consular armies. The gladiator who descended a cliff with kitchen knives now commanded forces that made Rome tremble. But Rome's revenge would be biblical in scope. When Marcus Crassus finally cornered the slave army in 71 BCE, he brought 6 legions, 36,000 professional soldiers, not militia. The final battle was less combat than slaughter. Spartacus died fighting, his body never found among the countless dead. Some say the gladiators hid their leader's corpse, denying Rome even that trophy. 6,000 crucifixions along the Appian Way sent Rome's message to every slave in the Republic. For 100 miles, from Capua to Rome, crosses stood every 90 feet. The dying lined the road like grotesque milestones, some taking days to expire. Travelers walked this path of punishment for months, reminded with each step that Rome's vengeance was absolute. Yet Spartacus's body never found meant his legend never died. Whispers spread through slave quarters across the empire. The Thracian escaped, he waits in the mountains, he will return when slaves need him most. Rome had killed the man but created a myth more dangerous than any gladiator. The historical impact on Rome's slave policies proved significant. Never again would Rome underestimate servile rebellion. Gladiator schools implemented new security measures. Laws restricted slave gatherings. The Senate stationed permanent garrisons near large slave populations. Mount Vesuvius had taught Rome fear. Modern parallels to asymmetric warfare are obvious. Vesuvius demonstrated timeless principles. Superior numbers mean nothing without vigilance. Desperation creates innovation. Terrain can neutralize technological advantages. Most importantly, underestimating any enemy, especially one with nothing to lose, invites disaster. Military historians still study Spartacus's cliff descent as an example of tactical brilliance born from strategic desperation. Special forces units practice similar techniques, acknowledging a gladiator's innovation 2 millennia later. The principle remains unchanged. When conventional victory is impossible, create unconventional solutions. But here's what truly echoes through history. 70 men with kitchen knives changed history forever. Not through strength of arms, but through strength of will. They proved that the impossible was merely improbable, that determination could overcome discipline, that hope was the deadliest weapon of all. The gladiators of Mount Vesuvius didn't win their war. Freedom lasted 2 years before Roman iron crushed their dreams. But for one night on a mountain, slaves became soldiers, kitchen knives became swords, and the impossible became reality. Every subsequent rebellion, every fight against overwhelming odds, every refusal to accept inevitable defeat carries echoes of that night. In the end, Rome crucified the rebels but immortalized their message. Spartacus lost his war but won his place in history. The empire that tried to erase him instead ensured his remembrance. 2,000 years later, we still speak his name, not as slave or gladiator, but as the man who made Rome bleed. 70 gladiators with kitchen knives, 3,000 Roman soldiers, one impossible night. The arithmetic of history, written in blood on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, proving forever that sometimes the impossible is just another word for unprecedented.